Pome. So the first time we've had some Pome data sets in the last couple of years, which has been really enlightening for us, and the growers have been fantastic to work with, which has been great. We certainly want more of them. But again, the Pome profitability differences, or the things that really stand out to us, and saleable yield is absolutely a big one. Now, I think in Pome, what's really interesting is that there's a few more controllable factors around saleable yield. Certainly there's seasonal effects that can be real killers to businesses, but no different to what we see in Broadacre with frost and those sort of climatic events that you can't control. So, but some of the things in saleable yield and controlling that from a Pome point of view is, I think we've picked up at tree maintenance, like pruning, but also now these closer spacings, the high density spacings, nutrition, tree and crop protection. So obviously netting is something that the industry itself is investing heavily in and has been for a number of years, certain growers. So that's a good thing to see. And then obviously some of the harvest practices and timing, I think, what we've seen with the top 25% is they just don't miss on timing. And that's a really important thing when you've got a product that actually goes off pretty quick if it doesn't get picked on time. So in terms of varieties, I think, there's not something that points to a specific variety, and neither should it, because obviously consumers are wanting a broader range of varieties. But there's no specific variety itself that's actually standing out to us. The investment into capital, and I mentioned about netting, high density spacings. So I think these things here are really typical of those that are in the top 25%. And they've done those investments earlier or sooner rather than later, and probably making the change to take out some older varieties and put in newer ones quicker. So that's been interesting. And obviously the systemisation of labour. There's some really sophisticated labour tracking systems out there with growers in Pome, which is really, really interesting to us in the industry, through things like pruning, thinning, picking. So particularly picking, just tracking different labour or different employees as to how they're actually going with their efficiency. So a lot of challenges for the industry, but certainly some exciting stuff that's happening there. And the other little one, I guess, at the bottom is just the pollination varieties that are in and out of orchards now. So, proper spacings of those. I'm not a guru on apple agronomy by far. There's some lot more brilliant minds out there than me on that, but certainly one of the things that we've picked up is it seems to be that that production, so yield of those varieties that you're chasing, and pollinators within the orchard are quite important. And so that's been interesting for us. Okay, so how does it look in Pome 1920? So 1920. Again, similar graph to what we've seen in the vegetables. So the green being the operating profit, the income, the black being the operating costs, and the light blue being the operating profit per hectare. So what we saw in 1920 was our first year dipping into the Pome growers. I'm going to skip through this a little bit, Bryn, because once we get to 2021, we start to see some similarities between the 2 years. So obviously the income number again driving the difference, between the top 25% and the average of the industry, and a slight difference.
Those operating costs, even where in vegetables we saw the top 25 and the average very close, and then the bottom 25 is almost a bit lower. Even the bottom 25% here is comparable to the average and the top 25.
Well, it's definitely comparable to the average. I think what we've probably seen is this little gap starting, like it's nearly $20,000 a hectare. I think it's $18,000 a hectare from memory. The difference between that cost of the top cost of the top 25% at 80, and the cost of the average of the industry just above 60. So that, I think that's starting to be a gap that's starting to move. So is that, what is there in there? What are the top 25 spending more money on? Is it wages? Is it fertiliser, is it? It won't be netting because that's a capital cost. So these are operational costs, remember? So what is happening there to actually get that yield? So that's an interesting dive into that. And then obviously here we're starting to see this gap pull apart from the average to the top 25, and that's around apple yield. So here we're seeing I think it's just under 11 tonnes to the hectare difference between the top 25% and the average of saleable yield. This is not just yield and then dropped on the ground or not being able to be sold. This is saleable yield. And then the similar ratios that we've talked about before, operating efficiency, you can see the top 25% again are under there. They just slightly come in at under 60%, which is a really, really good result. And one thing we have noticed in the pome growers is that they are much closer to the 70% target operating efficiency than vegetable growers are. And so that just tells us that what they're spending, they're actually recouping in income to maintain that ratio. Certainly the top 25% don't have the highs of the income per hectare, but still just over $120,000 per hectare of income. Good number to have at an operating versus the industry average of just under 100,000, 97,000, I think it was. And again, on the far right is the return on capital. So the best in the industry doing 10% and the average just doing over 5. I think it was just under 6% for that year. So let's head to 2021, and this is where you're actually seeing this equalisation or closer to the similar spend per hectare, Bryn, which I think you were alluding to before. So, in that year, 2021, which you can see was from an income point of view, the top 25% were slightly under 110,000, a little bit better result from the average of the industry, but the cost per hectare virtually between the bottom 25% and the top were virtually negligible. So the growers are spending similar on operating costs per hectare, but the best growers are getting more saleable yield and income. Now, the question will be out there maybe is, are these growers in the top 25 getting better price for their product? Now in 2021, the difference between the bottom, the average and the top 25% was 1 cent per kilo in price.
So that answers that question.
So it's not a price thing. It's actually all about saleable yield and what you spend to actually get that saleable yield. So a really interesting result and data set across the pome industry across those years. So that was 2021. And I think if you put the 2 years together, the difference in price received per kilo for all growers in the data set was 5 cents a kilo. So not very much at all. All right. So in that year, again, we can see the apple yield driving. So just under 10 tonnes per hectare. So that's really and this is the average yield across all varieties, and this is saleable yield. Operating efficiency, again, the best are under the 70% target, and our pome income per hectare, the gap is closer between the average of the industry and the best, and 2021 wasn't the best yield and price year, but the return on capital shows that, I think, is at 6% for the best, and the average of the industry sitting at just under 4. So a tougher year again in 2021 for apple growers. And their 2-year results, again, a smaller data set, Bryn, but I think a really interesting data set in terms of the operating efficiency. And I mentioned that to you before, is that you can see that the average of the industry sits at that 72% over the couple of years. So certainly whatever they spend in dollars of operating, they're able to actually get that return in income. So we're seeing that difference between them and vegetables, but the returns on capital are certainly far less for the pome growers over those 2 years anyway, for the data we've got. That's not necessarily meaning historically or going forward, but certainly for those 2 years sits at just under 5%. And then again, an equity percentage whereby the growers are actually well capitalised in the industry. And again, here, I think for the industry, this is well capitalised in their businesses to look at investment into closer spacings, high density spacings, netting, replacing older varieties. So, if the business's ultimate visions and goals are to continue into Pome, then obviously making some of the decisions around that or doing that return on investment analysis is quite a simple thing to do, to look at whether it's valuable.
Yeah.
And the operating profit result, so over the 2 years, and the operating efficiency. So what we're trying to depict here is a similar graph to what we've done with the vegetables bin, was actually gathering this data together over a number of years to actually see where the industry sits. So what we'd probably see here more likely is the difference between 1920 and 2021 being up and down years, but certainly it can still show that the return on investment can still be there, the return on capital can still be there. It's below some of the targets in 1 year. The operating profit can improve, but the equity, so the capitalisation of the businesses is strong, which is a good sign.